There are many reasons why a person might need to have an organ transplant, but the main one is to be able to continue to live. We know there are many organs people can donate. However, today we'll just focus on the heart. The heart, as a few more organs in the human body, is essential so that we can live. And in some cases, a bad nutrition, lack of exercise, and increased stress can cause damage to this organ. So when you reach a point where you depend on having a new heart to be able to continue to live, you enter the waiting list. Literally thousands of people in just a small country wait for years to receive a new organ that saves their lives. Which is why when you're qualified to receive a transplant, you'll feel somewhat relieved to know you'll live for a few more years. But what happens when instead of having a fresh start thanks to the transplant, you start living the life of the person who donated his or her organ and not your own? It sounds unlikely, but it has actually happened, and this is one of the cases. In 1995, a 57-year-old man, Sonny Graham, was on the verge of death. He had been entered into the hospital due to a congestive heart failure and was in need of an urgent transplant that would help keep him alive. Luckily for him, he got one in just 6 months. But whose heart was Mr. Graham getting? Well, a 33-year-old man named Terry Cottle had just died a victim of a suicide. He'd held a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. His organs, however, were intact, and so they could be donated. At first, Mr. Graham didn't know the identity of the donor or even the reason of his death. He was just happy to know doctors were going to be able to save his life. After receiving the news, Mr. Graham went to the hospital from his home nearby and had the heart transplanted that very same day. The procedure was a success, and Mr. Graham continued to live. During his first year after the transplant, he lived a quiet life and never worried about anything. But all of a sudden, he got curious to know who the family of the donor was, and so he contacted the organ donation agency and asked for information. After getting the intel he needed, Mr. Graham decided to take the time to thank Mr. Cottle's family for the gift of life. He started to send messages to his donor's widow, and after some time, they both met. Cheryl, a mother of 4, gave love one more chance and ended up marrying her late husband's heart recipient, Mr. Graham. They fell for each other, and once they were married, they decided to take a step further in their relationship and moved to the state of Georgia. Shortly after the wedding, Mr. Graham said, "It helped me so much. Meeting Cheryl made it easier for me, knowing something so good came from something so bad." As it seems, they were truly in love, but everything changed when in 2007, being 69 years old, Mr. Graham did the unexpected. He took his own life in a very similar way to what Cheryl's former husband had done. He grabbed a shotgun, pointed to his throat, and pulled the trigger. His body was found in the garage he and Cheryl shared. Police officers checked the scene and sent Mr. Graham's corpse to be examined by a coroner. In a matter of hours, it was determined Mr. Graham had indeed died victim of a suicide. But what's weird is that according to his friends, he never showed any signs of depression. To the contrary, he always seemed to be so happy. So if he wasn't depressed, then what drove him to take such a fatal decision? Well, no one knows for sure, but some people believe it all had to do with the donated heart. How so, you might ask? Well, scientists say there are more than 70 documented cases in which transplant patients get personality changes after they receive a new organ. Most of the time, they take on some of the characteristics of the donor. Just to mention an example, a woman from Lancashire, Cheryl Johnson, said to have her literary taste changed after having a kidney transplant. First, she used to read celebrity bios and bestsellers such as The Da Vinci Code, but after the transplant, she started to enjoy classics such as Jane Austen's Persuasion and Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This phenomenon, not yet explained by science, is better known as cellular memory. Just as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, some people don't get to live their lives after an organ transplant, but the lives of their donors. Mr. Graham was one of those people. Not only did he marry his donor's widow, but he also died the same way his donor did.